Tonight on Nova, a tale of high adventure from a nearly vanished past. 500 years before Columbus, the Vikings reached North America. Who were the people they met there? What happened when two worlds collided? Archaeologists are now revealing an extraordinary story of tragedy and triumph. Vikings in America.
Funding for Nova is provided by
Merck, dedicated to pharmaceutical research, committed to discovery, improving health, extending life. Merck.
and Lockheed, America's aerospace company, supporting math, science, and engineering education for national technology leadership. Major funding for Nova is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by annual financial support from viewers like you.
It was the end of the 8th century and the beginning of a new era. The people of Scandinavia, born in a place where land and sea merged, set out to conquer both. They took to the sea with unequaled boldness, urged on by their fearless gods Odin and Thor. For a time, it seemed that nothing could stop them. From Scandinavia, they swept through Europe eager for riches. Some knew them as Norse or Northmen, but the name remembered best is Vikings, raiders from the sea. For the next 300 years, this would be the Viking Age. It was said that Europe once prayed, "Save us, O Lord, from the fury of the Northmen." This 9th century Viking ship served as a coffin for a Norwegian queen. It's about the same length as a typical warship, which could carry a crew of 35 men and could be sailed or rowed in shallow waters or the high seas. It's been called the most beautiful ship in the world. This eerie mixture of beauty and menace is common in Norse art. The world the Norse lived in was full of enemies, both real and imagined, where the choice was often seen as kill or be killed.
Part of the way the Norse divided the world up around them was by categorizing space and territory as being safe and dangerous. But they also characterized different groups of people. There were savages who were not as advanced as the Norse. They didn't have iron, they didn't have pottery, they were often nomadic hunters. There were barbarians, like the Norsemen themselves, and they knew they were barbarians. And there were civilized people who lived in cities, and the Norse knew they weren't those. And outside of that group of known types of humans, there were also a whole range of magical creatures, and these included trolls, they included land spirits, they included sea spirits, and a whole range of creatures in between. And when you encountered something out in the wild, there was a real question about whether what you encountered was human or non-human, despite its apparent similarity in form to you. And the Norse tendency to try out their swords and axes on whoever they ran into, in part is just an expression of aggressiveness, and in part a way of finding out. Are they creatures that can be killed by metal like humans, or are they creatures like trolls who can't be damaged by iron?
Against the civilized world, the Norse were a formidable force. The Norwegians attacked Britain. The Danes lay siege to Paris. The Swedes pushed into Russia. They threatened Constantinople. By the year 1000, the reach of the Norse was remarkably long. But it was a group of settlers, not warriors, who reached the furthest, all the way to North America, 5 centuries before Columbus set sail. Why did the Norse travel so far west, beyond the boundaries of the known world? What were they looking for? And why did history nearly forget them? The search for answers begins in Iceland, a rugged monument to a lesser-known side of Norse society, where colonists sought to build a new life, not raid or plunder. In the 9th and 10th centuries, thousands of settlers migrated to Iceland from Norway. Most lived off the land, fishing, hunting, and growing crops. They raised animals. They were craftsmen and traders. They built simple houses out of sod, stone, and wood, and lived on widely scattered farms a half-mile or more apart. But after the land was divided, the best way for ambitious men to better themselves was to leave Iceland and find new, unsettled territory. Because of their conception of the world, they just assumed it was out there.
What kind of world did they think they were living in and traveling around? Well, it's a confused picture. But so far as we can tell, the Viking world picture was one of a round earth, a round world, let us say, which was either flat or slightly saucer-shaped. Central to it was the inner sea. That would be the Atlantic and its contiguous waters. Surrounding the sea would be a land ring. They were quite convinced about this, and they had one great benefit and comfort from this notion of the world. Wherever a Norse sailor sailed, he was enclosed by land. And they knew from their own experience that this started somewhere east of the north of Norway and went over the White Sea, right round the top of the frozen world, came to Greenland, and then proceeded to come down the other side. So they would expect land to be out that other side in a theoretic way.
The Norse voyages to the west were first described in the Icelandic Sagas, stories passed on by word of mouth, then written down by monks 300 years later, when the Norse were literate and Christian. These sagas tell of a Norse chieftain named Eric the Red, who sailed west from Iceland in the year 986 with a group of other colonists. Today, a joint Norwegian-Icelandic expedition is following in their wake. The Norse voyage was possible only because the world's climate had grown warmer, and the ice was no longer an insurmountable barrier to Viking ships. As the leader of the group, Eric named the land he reached Greenland, for he said that people would be more tempted to go there if it had an attractive name. At first, Greenland seemed promising. Although native people once lived here, they had left long ago. And there was more than enough room for a Norse way of life. But Greenland had barely any timber. The soil was rocky, the growing season short. It could only support a few thousand settlers on widely scattered farms. So when word reached the colony that a new land had been sighted even further to the west, the news was warmly greeted.
It was not unnatural that somebody would have a look for this new land that was across the water, because the almost a key to what the Northerners were doing for some centuries. They were looking for pasture, fisheries, territory, cultivable land. They were looking for, if you like, a better life. So somebody was going to look for it. And the man who went, according to Greenlander's saga, was Leif Erikson, the son of Eric the Red. And he prepared an expedition, a ship, a crew, to probably be of about 30 to 35 men. They would have stores, they would have weapons, and they would be intensely self-reliant.
In or around the year 1000, the Norse sailed west again, calculating their latitude by the angle of the sun during the day and the North Star at night. But in rough weather, they would have to steer by guess or by prayer. A Norse ship was small and crowded. It was open to the elements. Every large wave in a storm was a threat. And who knew what dangers lay before them in an unexplored land? "500 years before Columbus, Leif Erikson and his crew reached the New World. After sailing across the Davis Strait to Baffin Island in present-day Canada, they were about to begin another, even more remarkable journey. Tracing the route of the Norse in America, Smithsonian archaeologist William Fitzhugh arrives in Baffin Island. For much of his career, Fitzhugh has explored the coast of eastern Canada, piecing together the history of the native peoples who lived here and the Norse who arrived 1,000 years ago.
When the Norse started their voyaging westward from Greenland, they encountered a land they called Helluland, or flat rock land, which is certainly the east coast of Baffin Island. And it could well have been this country right around us here. The area is full of huge slab rocks, of mountains, of towering glaciers coming down to the sea. It's a very stark land with tumble-down rocks and big cliffs and boulders strewn around the beach. I think they must have been incredibly surprised to travel only a few hundred miles across Davis Strait and to reach the East Baffin coast and discover that this land was incredibly different from the one that they had left, and also incredibly more difficult for living a Norse style of life. The Norse did not remain long in East Baffin, as far as we can tell from the records and from archaeological studies. They merely touched down here. They probably obtained water. They might have hunted caribou for fresh meat. But it seems that they quickly departed and headed south looking for a better land for settlement.
Fitzhugh and his team are following the Norse route in the Pitsalak, a Smithsonian research vessel. Even though a millennium has passed, the coast remains as bleak and desolate as it was in Leif Erikson's day. Searching for a more hospitable land, the Norse would have hugged the coast until they reached Resolution Island.
We're in the southern tip of Resolution Island, the large island off the south corner of Baffin Island, out in the middle of Hudson Strait. This is the last place that you've got land until you cross to the Button Islands and Labrador, and it would have been a major jumping off place for the Vikings on their way south. We're going to leave here in a few minutes now and try a crossing. The wind's coming out of the northeast. It could be a little rough, but we shouldn't have too much trouble. We'll have a little better power than the Norse. We're running diesel engines here. We travel about 10 knots. But in this kind of crossing, I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't spend just about the same amount of time that we do. Most of the North Atlantic voyages were fairly short, only 200 to 250 miles, maybe occasionally. I think the biggest stretch is about 500 miles. But these could be traveled in the course of 3 or 4 days with favorable winds. They always tried to select a wind direction that would give them a good sailing reach, and if they did run into headwinds, they had to turn back or had to row. Probably the most difficult thing that they would encounter would not be the weather or the unknown shores, but the uncertainties of people that they might find there. When they anchored and came ashore, they were pretty vulnerable to native people who lived in the areas, who knew the land, who could sneak up on them at night or could ambush them. And for this reason, they say they often departed from various regions and didn't stay in one place very long.
There were 2 different native cultures in northern Labrador when the Norse arrived, the Dorset and the Thule. The Dorset, known for their extraordinary art, were a Paleo-Eskimo people who migrated from Alaska about 4,000 years ago. It was the traces of the Dorset that the Norse found in Greenland when they settled there. The other native culture in northern Labrador was a new arrival from the west, the Thule Inuit, who would eventually displace the Dorset. More technologically advanced, the Thule were the ancestors of the modern Eskimo people. Unlike Greenland, this land belonged to others. When the Smithsonian team reaches the tip of Labrador, they stop to explore a native site where both Dorset and Thule once lived.
Nuningok sits on a little point jutting out into the McClellan Strait, and we can see behind us here the fierce tidal currents that are running through. This is what makes this site so great in terms of a hunting place. You can sit on the rocks and harpoon seals as they come by. It's a place where whales transit between Ungava Bay and Labrador. Nuningok was occupied during the fall and winter months. It was a protected place from storms. The sods gave good building material. The house pits are very deep and would have been warm. People stayed here through the harp seal migration and into the winter. At the time the Norse people arrived here, it certainly was occupied by Inuit peoples, either Dorset culture or Thule people. The Norse called them Skrælings. They couldn't distinguish between the 2 cultures. And they described them as very strange indeed. I'm right at the entrance of one of the largest houses in the Nuningok site. It's a big sod house with a long entrance passage. I'm standing now in the door, what's known as the cold trap. There was a place where they built up a kind of a sill where they would step over into the house, and the sill would keep out the cold air from the entrance passage below. And then you enter into the house floor itself inside. The work area is generally right in the middle of the house, and you can see stones piled up here. The houses are very difficult to excavate, but by dissecting these houses, we can really tell a story back through time and eventually get down to the lowest floors, the Dorset house floors. And often we find that the people who came later in these locations built their house pits right into the house pits of the people who preceded them. It was easier to do that. The sod walls were already standing, and so they just basically deepened and enlarged those earlier houses. So people kept returning to these sites because they already had house pits there, they had sods there. It was kind of like real estate that was already established. And it was easier for them to enlarge or deepen an earlier house than it was to dig a new one. At the base of the midden, coming out of these big houses up on the hill, we find lots of charred rock encrusted with seal fat. Here's a hearthstone with seal fat all encrusted over it. There are flint tools eroding out of the bank, ramachurt tools. There are 4,000 years of prehistory that are in these eroding middens. Quite a lot of food bone, walrus jaws, caribou vertebra. All of this stuff, the remains of ancient meals going back thousands of years.
We are not sure where or when the Norse and native peoples first met. But at that moment, the human race encircled the globe for the very first time. Leaving the northern tip of Labrador, the Norse sailed south along the coast.
Yeah, this is the most rugged region of the Labrador coast, and there are really rugged, steep mountains here, come down to the sea about 4,000 feet. It's heavily glaciated, and the fjords are pretty steep-walled and not easy to get ashore in or find good camping places. There's almost nothing growing up here, so it's an area that the Vikings would have passed over pretty quickly. But when they came down this coast, they must have been staying offshore more or less like we are now. If you get too close to the rocks, you get a lot of nasty currents and tides. The winds are much worse right along the shore than they are a few miles off. So we're probably tracking pretty much along the way that some of the Norsemen may have come.
"300 300 miles down the Labrador coast, the Norse saw land more to their liking. Here the hills began to soften. The Norse found precious timber and protected harbors. This was a land worth sailing to.
We've reached the central Labrador coast, an area that the Norse called markland or forest land. It's a region of greatly warmer climate, more moisture. There's a lot more grass, shrubbery. It's an area that provided the Norse with a lot of material that they were missing in Iceland and in Greenland. Not only do we have willows, which were present in Greenland, but we have spruce trees, which provided them with timbers for building houses, for building boats, and for making all sorts of utensils and artifacts they needed that couldn't be obtained anywhere else in the North Atlantic. So Markland, or the Central Labrador Coast region, really provided them with something for the first time that they saw a great promise in. And if we look at the humpy rocks, the deep bays, the scattered vegetation clumps, the dwarf birch and lichens, the general feeling of this landscape is almost identical to the west coast of Norway. And I think they would have felt very at home as they approached this land and began to realize that by heading south, they're entering a country that's much more like that they came from.
The Norse were pleased with Markland, but they expected to find even better land further down the coast. From the Sagas, we know that they saw this 30-mile-long stretch of beach, which they called the Wonder Strands. From here, it was only a few days' sail to the place where they finally settled. According to the Sagas, they passed between an island and a cape, then came ashore where a river flowed out of a lake. The Sagas explain what happened next.
They decided to winter there and built a big house. The nature of the land was so choice, it seemed to them that none of the cattle would need fodder for the winter. Day and night were of more equal length than in either Greenland or Iceland. There were vines growing there. Leif said to his men, "On alternate days, we must gather the grapes and cut vines, and then fell trees to make a cargo for my ship." Leif named the colony after its natural qualities and called it Vinland, Wineland.
But where exactly was Vinland? For more than a century, dozens of possibilities were raised, including Florida and Minnesota. But if the Sagas are accurate, Vinland had to lie within striking distance of the Wonder Strands. In the 1950s, a Norwegian writer, Helge Ingstad, searched for Vinland in Newfoundland with his wife Anna Steen Ingstad, an archaeologist.
We've searched and we've searched, traveled along the coast of Newfoundland, in and out the fjords, and it was very disappointing. People thought we were half crazy asking about the ruins of people that lived 1,000 years ago. And then I came to this small settlement, Lens of Meadows. Beautiful little place, very isolated.
Ingstad arrived in Lanzo Meadows in 1960. There he met a local fisherman named George Decker.
Asked him the questions I always asked, and I had been disappointed so many times. And then he answered right away, "Yes, there is some ruins here, follow me." George and I, we went a little to the west, across a large plain. There was a bay and a small creek, a beautiful little creek called Black Duck Brook. And towards this brook was running an old terrace. Then he pointed to something, and there it was.
Along the terrace were the remains of ancient buildings. The Ingstads began digging a year later. Radiocarbon dating told them the site was about 1,000 years old. They found the remains of 8 sod-walled structures. They found fireplaces of traditional Norse design. But the breakthrough was the remains of a smithy and the presence of smelted iron. Although some native people used iron chipped from meteoric rock, they didn't know how to melt and refine it. Only the Norse did. Then, finally, the purpose of the smithy. An iron nail used to repair a Norse ship. Archaeological evidence was proving what the Sagas had always claimed. The Norse had reached the New World 1,000 years ago. But was Lonzo Meadows Leif Erikson's Vinland or another Norse settlement? The controversy began immediately. Since wild grapes aren't found this far north, some believe that the real Vinland has yet to be found further south. They believe that this was a base camp used by later Norse colonists who sailed here in the years that followed. But others argue that Lonzo Meadows fits too many other details in the sagas to be anything else but Vinland. Whatever the case, Lonzo Meadows, now with reconstructed houses, is the only authentic Norse site in North America. Birgitta Wallace was part of the archaeological team.
I was working for Anne Stine Ingstad one summer, and it was a cold, miserable summer, and we were not finding very much. But I was digging a trench right outside here, and when we were just frozen stiff, we came upon this little item, which made us extremely excited. I called over to Anne Stine and she said, "Are you mad?" And we danced around. What it is, this is a spindle whorl that was on a spindle. And not only is it of Viking period type, but its spinning was usually done by women in our society. So we rather knew that women had been here. And that was a very exciting moment. The women had probably come as domestics to cook food, clean clothes, and keep the fires going, because you didn't have the ratio of women to men that you would do on farms, you know, where you had families. From all we know, most of the objects are associated with men here. So it was not a normal family life. This is a reconstruction of one of the large halls, and as you can see, it's very large. It's really over 90 feet long, and it's built of sod over a timber frame. And the walls are thick, and it takes an enormous quantity of sod to build one of these buildings. It's built up according to the archaeological evidence, but archaeological evidence is often imperfect, and one thing we often don't get is the roof construction. So you have to go on what you know about these buildings from elsewhere. Up to about 30 people could live in a building like this. This would have been the living room in one of the big halls, and also the sleeping room, because there would have been beds all along these platforms. And you have to imagine this room with a sparkling fire in the middle of the floor and people sitting here in the evening eating dinner, which has been cooked over the open fire, telling stories, and it would have been nice, warm and cozy, and probably very crowded. When the Norse left, they took everything with them. All that was left for us to find were things they had dropped and never found again. Fortunately, one of them dropped this little bronze pin. It's a pin to close a cloak on the shoulder instead of with a button. It's a style of pin that the Norse learnt about in Ireland, and we can date it pretty well to either the very late 10th century or early 11th century. There are many unusual things about this site for being a Norse site, and one is the location. Normally, the Norse did not, when they built a farm, they did not build it this close to the water in a very open, exposed area like this. But one reason the Norse stayed here was probably because it was uninhabited at the time they came. There had been people here before them, and there came people after them, but right when they were here, there were no other people here. And the areas farther south were very heavily populated.
After staying the winter, Leif Erikson returned to Greenland. Soon after his arrival, his father, Eric the Red, died, and Leif took his place. He would never again set foot in the New World. But there were 3 more voyages from Greenland to Vinland, all within 10 to 20 years. The next was undertaken by Leif's brother, Torvald, who decided to see the new land for himself. According to the Sagas, while Torvald was exploring north of the Vinland colony, he went ashore at what is now called English River in Labrador.
"This is a lovely place," he said, "and here I should like to make my home." Then they saw 3 mounds on the sand up inside the headland. They walked up to them and could see 3 skin boats there and 3 Skraelings under each. So they divided forces and laid hands on them all, except one who got away with his canoe. The other 8 they killed. Soon they came from inside the fjord, a countless fleet of skin boats, and attacked them. The Skraelings kept shooting arrows at them, but then they fled away, each one as fast as he could. "I have a wound under my arm," said Torvald. "Here is the arrow, and it will be the death of me."
It seemed like archaeological exploration around English River might actually turn up the remains of Torvald's grave, and so we hunted around and found that the forest cover is so thick that there was no way that you could find the remains of a small stone grave. But on the islands off the coast, we found the remains of other settlements dating to the same period, to around 1000 AD, small hut rings, tent sites, and so on. And in them we found artifacts of a different sort than we had expected. The Skraelings have always been thought to be Eskimo peoples because of the descriptions of their double-bladed paddles and their skin boats. But in fact, what we found in these settlements were remains of another culture, an Indian culture we know as Point Revenge. Very similar artifacts have been found in Greenland, and in fact a point similar to this came from the Sandness graveyard, Eric the Red's graveyard. We don't know if it was actually in the body of a Norseman who had come from Markland, but it's possible. But it does indicate that there is direct contact between the Norse and the native people in Labrador, that they brought back artifacts which we know stylistically were Indian and not Eskimo. So using archaeological information, you can determine actually the kinds of people that these Skraelings were.
The Point Revenge people were one of a number of different Indian groups living in Labrador when the Norse arrived. This caribou skin clothing was made by the descendants of the Point Revenge people centuries later. In Newfoundland, the Norse might have met the ancestors of the Beothuk who carved this doll. The ancestral Beothuk lived in small bands of closely related families. They preferred to travel by canoe, and in the spring and summer fished along the coast, where the Norse might have first seen them. Although their population was less than a few thousand, they were more than a match for the Norse. After Thorvald's death, the Norse tried again. Their most ambitious attempt to settle in Vinland was undertaken by a group of 150 colonists, led by Thorfinn Karlsefni. But once again, the gulf between the Norse and the native peoples proved very wide.
We are told that the Skraeling first wanted weapons, being no fools. Being no fools, the Norsemen refused to give them weapons, but instead tried to find other things they'd be interested in. They gave them cloth, which of course these people in their beautifully made skins had never seen before. And like good businessmen, the Norse tried to find out what the smallest strip of cloth they could exchange would be, cutting it into finer and finer bits, as we're told. But then they started trading a new product, milk, which of course the Native Americans had never seen since they were weaned from their mothers, and drank, as we were told, considerable quantities of it and took more away. We now know that these same Skraeling who departed so happily with their tummies full of milk, within a few hours were almost certainly encountering severe stomach cramps and increasing pain and nausea as their lactase-deficient stomachs began to reject this strange liquid that they put into themselves. So a few hours later, the Skraeling almost certainly thought they'd been poisoned, and probably at that point began to lay plans for their next return to deal with these magical, dangerous poisoners.
Karlsefni's attempt to explore and colonize Vinland lasted 3 years, and even saw the birth of the first European child in the New World. But in time, these colonists, like their predecessors, gave up and returned home to Greenland. After one last attempt to settle here failed, the Norse abandoned the Vinland colony.
Why didn't the Norse stay in North America? Why didn't they succeed in making a permanent colony? They didn't settle here because of opposition from the Aboriginal peoples. They were not strong enough. They didn't have the technology or the numbers to allow them to come into somebody else's country and take it over. And they certainly gave it a try. In someplace perhaps like Lansomeadow, maybe at Lansomeadow, maybe at some other settlement where Karlsefni tried to establish his colony. And after a year or so there, it became apparent that they were never going to be safe. They simply could not establish themselves in the security which they would want to live in their country. So they simply packed up and went back to Greenland, where there were still no Aboriginal people, and where conditions might not have been as good as they were in Vinland, but at least they were safe.
But only a few generations passed before the Norse were confronted with the Skraelings again, when Thule Inuit migrated to Greenland from Arctic Canada. These watercolors, painted by an Inuit artist, depict a traditional Inuit tale about their contacts with the Norse. At first, the two groups greeted each other warmly. But over time, they became mistrustful, convinced the other side would attack. According to the story, the Norse struck first. They attacked the Inuits' camp when the men were off hunting and massacred the women and children. When the Inuit men returned, they found the bodies and vowed revenge. They built a large skin boat, and with the help of a shaman's spell, disguised it as an ice floe. Then they floated the bewitched boat past the Norsemen, who suspected nothing. Most of the Norse were inside their house, gambling with the head of one of their victims. Then it was the Inuit who struck without mercy. They surrounded the house and set it on fire. The chief of the Norse escaped with his infant son, but when the Inuit pursued him, he kissed the boy goodbye and threw him into a lake. Only one man survived by escaping in a boat. Just as the wind filled the sails, the story concludes, a deep sigh was heard from the Norsemen. But if the sagas of both Inuit and Norse depict Greenland as a battleground, recent archaeological discoveries paint a different picture.
There's a suggestion of trade in the iron artifacts that are being recovered from Thule Inuit sites. The Thule Inuit were an Iron Age people. We know that they came to the Canadian Arctic, to the Eastern Arctic, with a knowledge of metal use and working of metal, and they took advantage of the Cape York meteorite in northern Greenland as a source of metal for arming their weapons and tools. But in addition to that, in Thule Inuit sites, we find smelted iron. Obviously iron that has come from the Norse colonies in Greenland. So the suggestion is that there might have been some kind of trading relationship going on here, metal for walrus ivory, ivory being a commodity that the Norse wanted to send back and did send back to Europe.
But what about here in North America, along the jagged coastline of Helluland, Markland, and Vinland? Could there have been continued contact between the Norse and native peoples, even after the Vinland colony was abandoned? Archaeologists now say yes.
For both archaeological evidence and the Icelandic records, we have at least hints that the Greenlandic Norse were visiting North America for a period of 200 or 300 years, starting at the time of the Vinland voyages, and probably ending with at least occasional trips to Labrador, probably to chop down timber, which was a very scarce commodity in Greenland. And the last record we have is, I believe, the year 1347. There's a reference to a ship from Markland, which was probably visiting Labrador to chop down some lumber. We also have the small find of an Inuit doll representing a European, dressed in a long robe-like garment split up the front, and with a cross on the chest. This is very different from most Inuit carvings of the time, which look more like this. This shows someone with the same flat face and silhouette outline, but dressed in Inuit clothing, including long pair of pants here, meeting the high boots. So this is the only carving which shows somebody who is obviously a European, and strongly suggests that the person who made the carving, somewhere on Baffin Island, sometime in the 13th century, saw a Norse Greenlander.
There have only been a handful of Norse artifacts found in North America. One of the most intriguing was discovered on the central Maine coast at an Indian settlement. It's a Norwegian coin, minted in the mid-11th century, a few decades after the Norse left Vinland. And this is part of a Norseman's scale used to weigh trade goods. It was found in the Canadian Arctic. From just a few small clues, archaeologists have constructed a new theory about trade among northern peoples.
Most of the Norse material which we find in these old Inuit villages which we excavate are little scraps of metal which have been made into knife blades and so on. Occasionally, however, we do find something larger, something a little more interesting. And this specimen here is the one which originally got me interested in the Norse problem. It was found about 20 years ago on a little village that I was excavating. And it's a portion of a bronze bowl, cast bronze. It would have been, 30 centimeters across, about a foot across, I guess, originally. And We found this and began to think it was obviously a piece of Norse bronzeware. We brought it back and had it analyzed, and it turns out that it wasn't Norse. It's Asiatic, either Chinese or apparently more likely Central Asiatic. And this sort of material was being imported by the Norse into Scandinavia through the Russian river system at the time. So it may well have come through the Norse trading network across the North Atlantic with the Norse to Greenland, and from there perhaps traded through the Inuit trade routes into Arctic Canada. Of course, it could probably just as likely have come around the other way. Its origin is just about halfway around the world from where it was found, but this one rather ugly little piece of metal certainly demonstrates how in medieval times things traveled a long way around the world.
For 300 years or more, a trade network linked the Norse and the native peoples of North America. But eventually, these contacts ended, until even the knowledge of their existence was lost. By the time Columbus sailed in 1492, the first bridge between the Old World and the New had been long forgotten. Even the story of the Norse in Greenland was coming to an end. Life here had always been hard. The growing season was short, the population was small, and then around the year 1200, life in Greenland became harder still. The world's climate began to cool, crops failed, the ice thickened. The colony's isolation grew. By the 15th century, only a few ships were arriving from Europe. The last recorded visit from Iceland was in 1410. The last recorded wedding was about the same time. These are the ruins of the church in which the ceremony took place. We know from skeletal remains that there was widespread malnutrition, disease, and early death.
Well, we knew that the weather grew very, very much colder, that the cattle began to die out. They did not get fresh grazing. At last, they were kept indoors. Human beings, animals, together. Then the cattle get into very short supply. And now we know that it is the breeding stock that is being killed off. And now we know there aren't any left. And now we know they're killing the dogs. And then there is silence.
Perhaps just as the last Norseman in Greenland lay dying, America was discovered yet again. Only this time, the Europeans had guns and came in great numbers and seized the New World for their own.
production of WGBH Boston. Funding for NOVA is provided by Lockheed, America's aerospace company, supporting math, science, and engineering education for national technology leadership.
And by Merck, dedicated to pharmaceutical research, committed to discovery, improving health, extending life. Merck.
Major funding for NOVA is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by annual financial support from viewers like you.
This is PBS.
Next time on Nova, humans may think they run the world, but there's another superpower who is really on top. They outnumber us 1,000,000 to 1, and little can stand in their way. They have engineers, weightlifters, soldiers, and royalty. Who is this superpower and what makes them so successful? Nova gets up close and personal with the little creatures who run the world. That's next time on Nova.
For a transcript of the NOVA program you've just seen, send $5 to this address or call 1-303-831-9000.